Is it time to reimagine your future? The right business skills may make a difference in your career. At Capella University, we offer a relevant education that's designed to focus on what you need to know in the business world. We'll teach professional skills to help you pursue your goals, like business management, strategic planning, and effective communication. And you can apply these skills right away. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast about the LGBTQ world we're living in. And this week, that world looks a little darker for a lot of us. The United States reelected Donald Trump. I'm sorry if this is the first you're hearing of that. But that means two main things for trans and queer people. One, a lot of the rights and protections we currently have are more at risk now than they were a week ago. And two, new proactive attacks on LGBTQ people will likely ramp up, especially since, according to news reports, Republicans believe that their ads attacking trans people were some of the most successful ones of the campaign. So before we get started on this episode, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that a lot of you are probably feeling upset. Doesn't really begin to cover it. Horrified, maybe, terrified, deeply sad. And I hope you're taking care of yourself and your people. You know, this isn't a show where we need to pretend not to care about how politics affects us and the people we love. So I can say I'm right there with you, which I'm sure is cold comfort right now. But I just had an interview with a political operative earlier today who reminded me that for fascists to retain their power, their goal is to make the rest of us feel alone and powerless. So whatever we can do to stave off that feeling, that's what we should do. And for me, one thing that feels productive in this moment is getting a clear-eyed sense of what the next 4 years and beyond might bring. So to help me suss that out, I've invited my esteemed colleague and Bloomingdale, D.C. neighbor, Slate senior writer Mark Joseph Stern. We're going to talk about the legal threats to LGBTQ people under the next Trump administration. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Mark Joseph Stern.
Is your cold making it hard for you to get to sleep and leading to a bad morning? Switch to Mucinex Night Shift for fast, powerful nighttime multi-symptom cold and flu relief. Mucinex Night Shift fights your worst nighttime symptoms to help you get to sleep and wake up ready to go. Mucinex Night Shift. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
Hey, it's me, the Quenchies. I'm that late afternoon craving you just can't shake. Wait, what's that? Welch's Grape Aid? No! Made with real fruit and no added sugar, nothing answers the call of the Quenchies like Grape Aid. Got the Quenchies? Grab a Grape Aid in your juice aisle.
Feel your max with Brooks Running and the all-new Ghost Max 2. They're the shoes you deserve, designed to streamline your stride and help protect your body. Treat yourself to feel-good landings on an ultra-high stack of super comfy nitrogen-infused cushion that takes the edge off every step, every day. The Brooks Ghost Max 2. You know, technically, they're a form of self-care. Brooks, let's run there. Head to brooksrunning.com to learn more.
Mark, thank you so much for making time for us.
Of course. Thank you for having me on in this bleak stretch of, I think, recalibration and questioning how in the world we got to such a dark place and where the hell we go from here. I can't say I'll have all the answers, but I'm happy to talk it out with you.
Great. That's all we ask. So, you know, a lot of us are worried about what another Trump term will mean for us as queer people, as trans people. I know the morning after the election, we have a Slack channel at Slate where all LGBTQ people who work at Slate can chat with each other. And one colleague who is getting engaged to their partner, but they might not have a wedding for a while, they were asking us, you know, do you think we should get married now, before our wedding, you know, before Biden's term is up? I guess that's a good place to start. I mean, should they?
You know, young love is so inspirational to me that I would never tell a couple not to get married. But rushing a marriage strikes me as perhaps not the best idea and not necessary with a footnote. So basically, here's what I think. I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to outright overturn marriage equality with a 6-3 conservative majority. But I do think that if, say, Justice Sonia Sotomayor dies under Trump and he replaces her, that there's a very good chance that the Supreme Court could overturn marriage equality. What happens then? Well, listeners might remember that Joe Biden actually passed and signed a new federal statute that creates very important protections for same-sex couples. And it basically requires states to recognize and honor and respect same-sex marriages so long as they were entered into in a state where they were legal. So what does that language mean? Well, it's a little bit unclear what would happen if, say, a couple got married in Texas, where the law itself still bans same-sex marriage, but the federal courts have required the state to, allow for same-sex marriage, and then moved to another red state that didn't respect same-sex marriage. Would that couple still have a right to be considered married? Would they even have a right to be considered married in Texas? The federal court decisions that form the basis of their union were overturned. I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. And the upshot to my mind is, if you are gay, you should not be getting married in a red state that still has a ban on the books. Period. End of sentence. Again, the law is not super clear on what would happen if the Supreme Court overturned marriage equality, but I think it's ambiguous enough that a court that overturns marriage equality is also going to interpret this law very narrowly. So I think it is imperative that gay couples who choose to get married do so in a blue jurisdiction, in a blue state or DC that has expressly authorized marriage equality, not through the federal courts, but through the Democratic process or through the state courts. Because if the federal judiciary pulls the rug out from marriage equality, it's not clear that the new federal law will provide a backstop if you got married in a state that still says it's illegal and wants to enforce its ban, after the federal courts have pulled out that rug.
This is so interesting to me because, there are so many parallels with LGBTQ rights and abortion rights. And I know in Arizona, for instance, the abortion ban that's currently in place stems from a law passed in, I think, the 1860s that just, was never overturned. I guess a new law never replaced it. And so when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the court in Arizona was like, yeah, this law that was passed back then still stands. And so it makes sense that a lot of places now are trying to pass proactive, laws that establish abortion rights in their own states or enshrine it in the Constitution to make it even harder to repeal, should the state legislature switch hands. And so I wonder if you'll be seeing efforts in some of these other states. Red states, I'm sure you won't see a lot of success, but to sort of address some of these older laws that only really are nullified now by a fragile court decision.
Yeah, we already saw this in 2024. A handful of states, including California, enacted initiatives that repealed old bans on same-sex marriage. I think that's a really important process for every blue state and ideally purple states and even red states, if possible, to undertake. I think there should be pressure on those states to repeal those bans, in part because they're offensive and archaic, of course, but also because, again, they really do imperil gay couples' ability to rely on the legitimacy of their marriage certificate if the Supreme Court takes away that right as a constitutional liberty. It's, again, just totally unclear what would happen. And in the meantime, until that occurs nationwide, I think that people who go, maybe it's a destination wedding in Austin, which is a beautiful, fun place for much of the year. Don't do it, gay people. Don't be tempted. Stay in your blue jurisdiction and get married there. It just seems like this should be the baseline of precaution to undertake, unless and until every single state does the work that California did this cycle of removing those bans.
And, to be clear, you can have a wedding wherever you want, but the marriage license should be in a blue jurisdiction.
And, there are a lot of blue jurisdictions that make it super easy to get married now. So, for instance, in the District of Columbia, where you and I live, you don't even have to have someone officiate the marriage. You can do it yourself. You can self-officiate.
Yes, love that.
You can just do that. You can go get a piece of paper from the courthouse, self-officiate your wedding, and then go celebrate it wherever you want. Go celebrate it in the reddest of red states. Go to some Trumpy hellhole for all I care and celebrate your wedding there, but do the marriage in a place where it is protected under the law very clearly and explicitly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a couple weeks ago, Brian and I spoke with our co-host, Jules Gill Peterson, about the amicus brief she helped contribute to in the Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Skermeti. In that case, the DOJ is challenging Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming medical care for trans youth. Obviously, a Trump DOJ would not have taken on that case, but arguments are scheduled for December. So will that case still proceed?
So nobody really knows what's going to happen here. There is some precedent for the Justice Department simply allowing a case to be heard and decided, even if the agency switches hands in the middle of the process. So this happened in 2020 to 2021 when the Trump administration was asking the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act. The arguments were heard before Biden took office. Biden came in and his Justice Department said, well, let's just roll the dice and see what happens.
Why?
And well, because I think the signs were very good from the Supreme Court that the court was going to uphold the Affordable Care Act, and it did. And so I think there's going to be a lot of political calculations going into this. The court is likely going to hear arguments in December in Skermeti. I don't think that Biden's Justice Department will ask the court to cancel arguments. The question is then what happens on January 20th when the agency switches hands and a bunch of people who despise transgender Americans take power. Once again, I think it might depend on how arguments go.
Yeah.
I think it's quite possible that if the arguments go well for trans people, if Neil Gorsuch and John Roberts seem to think that this is brazen sex discrimination, that it's not permissible, then I think the Trump Justice Department tries to pull the case, switches positions and tells the Supreme Court, don't decide this. And then I think the court probably wouldn't decide it. It would dismiss the case. But, if the argument goes poorly for transgender people, it makes a lot of sense for the Trump Justice Department to just roll the dice and let the court decide, because if the court rules against trans people, then that will further the policy of the Trump administration and its Justice Department.
Right. And of course, we know that Supreme Court justices are like flying on private planes with major conservative donors all the time. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that they might have some knowledge beyond just, divining how the arguments go as to what the decision might be. Is that fair?
Sure, totally. I'll just add that conservative commentators who are really in the know right now are saying with absolute confidence that Sam Alito is going to retire in the spring and step down at the end of this term and give Trump an opportunity to replace him with another kind of hardcore partisan conservative. If they know that, if they're talking to Alito about that, they're probably talking to him about other things. And remember, before the decision in Dobbs was leaked to the public, it was leaked to the Wall Street Journal editorial board, which wrote a whole thing about how John Roberts needed to, side with the majority and stop trying to save Roe versus Wade. The Wall Street Journal editorial board is good friends with Sam Alito. They invite him to write for them. They do interviews with him. I think there will be a pretty clear flare from the court how this case will go down, and the Trump administration will decide from that how it will approach Skermeti, whether it wants to try to pull the case and prevent trans people from winning or just let trans people lose.
Are there any other cases that are in sort of a similar middle ground right now?
Yeah, there are a bunch.
I guess ones that apply to LGBTQ people.
Yeah, well, look, I don't really think so. Not right now. Skrmetti was very much caught in the calendar of a, transition between presidents. But there are a bunch of cases in the lower courts where the Justice Department is promoting rights for LGBTQ people and women. And of course, there's a huge intersection there. That there's obviously a close link between reproductive freedom and LGBTQ rights. And Biden's Justice Department is, very progressive, promoting LGBTQ equality, promoting reproductive freedom, promoting individual liberty. And I think Trump's Justice Department is going to come in and abandon all those cases, especially the ones that are likely to produce a progressive result. So there will be a lot of flips in the lower courts on LGBTQ issues and related issues. That will happen very fast.
And those are related to similar things about, gender affirming care or anti-discrimination or what are those
Or
about?
Anti-discrimination protections for gay Americans, transgender Americans, non-binary Americans under various federal laws and civil rights laws. Yeah, the Biden administration has interpreted those laws broadly. It's arguing in court for that interpretation. Trump is going to come in. He's going to, completely change those interpretations. And his Justice Department is going to say, we're not pushing this case anymore because we used to like LGBTQ people and now we don't, and we want them to lose.
All right, let's take a quick break.
So, you want to be a marketer. It's easy. You just have to score a ton of leads and figure out a way to turn them all into customers. Plus, manage a dozen channels, write a million blogs, and launch 100 campaigns all at once. When that's done, simply make your socials go viral and bring in record profits. No sweat. Okay, fine. It's a lot of sweat. But with HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools, launching benchmark-breaking campaigns is easier than ever. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the co-director of Shrek and the visionary behind Toy Story comes Spellbound, a magical new animated adventure starring Rachel Zegler, John Lithgow, Jennifer Lewis, Nathan Lane, and Titus Burgess with Javier Bardem and Nicole Kidman. When a powerful spell turns her parents into monsters, Princess Elian must journey into the wild to reverse the curse before it's too late. Watch Spellbound only on Netflix November 22nd.
We're back with Mark Joseph Stern, who covers the law and the courts for Slate. So you wrote a really good piece in Slate this week called "The Next Trump Administration's Crackdown on Abortion Will Be Swift, Brutal, and Nationwide." And you talk about how through the FDA and through the Comstock Act, the Trump administration will be able to, should it choose to, curb abortion access by curtailing the use of abortion medication, which currently accounts for about 2/3 of all abortions. And beyond that, it now accounts for a huge number of abortions in red states where people are getting abortion pills through the mail. And I was wondering, do you know if there's like a similar way that Trump could sort of unilaterally, through the executive branch, restrict access to hormone therapy for trans people?
So that's a great question. I think the answer is probably no. Although we should never underestimate Trump's hatred of transgender people. I mean, he ran an entire campaign that was, around vilifying trans people. But the important factor here is that hormone therapy and puberty blockers, as used for transgender healthcare, they're not actually FDA approved for that purpose. They're FDA approved for other purposes and used off-label for transgender healthcare. That doesn't mean that it's an illegitimate use of them. I want to be really clear. This is like a quirk of the U.S. medical system that many people misunderstand. When a drug company gets a drug approved for one thing, it can be approved for a ton of other things without having to go through a reapproval process. There are some drugs out there that were approved for one thing, but 98% of their use is for a different thing or a bunch of different things. Like, it's not at all surprising that the FDA has not approved these drugs for this particular use. But that means that the FDA is not positioned to do a heel turn on this and say, oh, no, these aren't allowed for this. We're withdrawing them. The FDA is not playing a major role there. And crucially, federal law, at least to my knowledge, does not have any archaic provision enacted years ago that everybody forgot about until now that makes it a crime to provide or ship hormone therapy to transgender people, to transgender children or adults. Of course, there are many states that now make this illegal or even a crime, but federally, this is largely just unregulated. So there are going to be a lot of ways that the Trump administration can curtail access to them, but I don't think we'll see a crackdown on the scale of what we're about to see when it comes to medication abortion.
Okay. Do you know if there are any other ways? I know a lot of this will depend on whether the Republicans control the House, which we might know by the time this episode airs, but
I think they will pretty clearly,
cool.
But with a very small majority.
So, yeah, I guess the size of the majority will also determine how far they're able to go or decide to go. But can you think of other things that we should be looking out for in terms of ways that like a Republican trifecta could attack trans healthcare for youth, but also for adults, which some states are doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Congress could pass a ban on the use of hormones and puberty blockers for transition-related healthcare and trans patients. It could adopt the reasoning that so many of these states are promoting, that this is, dangerous and untested and experimental, and just try to ban it altogether nationwide. I don't think it's likely to get 60 votes in the Senate, assuming that the legislative filibuster survives, but that is very much the position of a lot of Republican lawmakers. So, we should talk more about what Trump can do by himself, but I think this is a real threat. And I'm seeing so many Democrats now, including elected Democrats, walk back their support for trans rights, claiming that this is suddenly a liability. And I do fear that Republicans will try to exploit this as a wedge issue and at a minimum put forth some bill that makes it a crime to provide gender affirming care to minors on the federal level and try to get, 7 or 8 Democratic senators to sign on to it. If that happens, then the bill would absolutely pass. And even states like California that strongly protect this kind of medicine, they would see their laws overridden by a federal ban.
This seems to be possibly a major sort of like undersung threat, that there's this sense among a lot of people, I think, that living in a blue state provides some protections. And in some ways it does, but that feels less and less likely now that we see, such a huge majority on the Supreme Court ready to do Trump's bidding, Republicans, controlling both chambers of Congress and, of course, the White House. That feels like even less true in the next 4 years than it ever has before.
Yes, it's a dark time for transgender Americans. And I don't want to deny the fact that there were already a lot of dark aspects on this issue, states enacting these terrible laws. But now they're going to have an ally in the federal government and in the executive branch and in Congress and in the judiciary. It just feels like there's perhaps some naivete among some advocates, not all, but some advocates about, the ability that they have to fight this through the democratic process.
I know one thing that red states have already begun to do or try to do is removing trans health care from eligibility for Medicare and Medicaid. Is that something that could happen on the federal level too?
Yes, I'm very much worried about this. Medicare, the eligibility rules are they're not entirely set on the federal level. And the Biden administration has enacted some very strong protections for people on Medicare to access gender affirming care, the full range of treatments. I think that Trump's administration is going to come in and revoke those very quickly. And on Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act included this provision that prohibits discrimination based on sex that applies, according to the Biden administration, to LGBTQ people. I think the Trump administration is going to reverse that and argue that at a minimum, Medicaid has no obligation to cover trans people, and maybe even that Medicaid should not cover trans people. This is an area where I'm not sure if it could be done by executive policy or whether legislation would be required. But one way or another, the federal government could try to prohibit the use of Medicaid funding to cover trans healthcare, much like it prohibits the use of Medicaid funding to cover most abortions. So again, there are so many different avenues of attack that I don't want to sketch out one clear concrete scenario, but it is very much something that should be concerning. Again, even if you live in one of the blue states that protects access to gender affirming care through Medicaid, through insurance purchased on an Obamacare exchange, through regular private insurance, the federal government can play a very heavy-handed role here in trying to block that access.
I know another place that we've seen the Biden administration, move to protect trans people is through the Department of Education and non-discrimination protections for trans kids. I know Trump has promised to dismantle the Department of Education, which would obviously have an impact, but are there other things you're sort of worried about or expecting that he might do with that department to roll back some of the things that the Biden administration has done?
Yeah. So, I mean, in Trump's first term, he not only refused to acknowledge that Title IX protects LGBTQ students, his Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos actually argued that accommodations for LGBTQ students were violating Title IX. So, for instance, if a school or a school district or a state allowed transgender students to participate on the sports team that aligns with their gender identity, under Trump's Department of Education, that was a potential Title IX violation. And so, if Trump doesn't totally dismantle this agency, I do think he will use it as a weapon against, blue jurisdictions that are arguing for more inclusion here. I think that he and his allies and his cronies will claim that these jurisdictions actually have an obligation to discriminate against LGBTQ people and trans students in particular.
Man, this is so much to take in. One other thing that I've been thinking about, in part because I know a lot of people, my age friends, who are queer parents or considering becoming parents, is that, not just has pregnancy become a monumental risk for people living in red states right now, and that only stands to get worse under Trump, but, as far as the legal side of things goes, in terms of surrogacy, adoption, basic parental documents, what should people be aware of in terms of things the Trump administration might do to weaken LGBTQ people's ability to become parents?
Yeah, so as of now, this is so deeply divided between the states, and it depends entirely on where you live. So, there are some states where surrogacy is perfectly legal and the intended parents are easily able to establish legal parentage over their child, and it's no big deal. There are other states where surrogacy is totally banned and prohibited, and there's absolutely no way that anybody can participate in it. It's just, I would say, black and white, but really sort of blue and red. And that is also true to a lesser degree, but still in an important way, for lesbian couples who have a child. So in some jurisdictions, like for instance, DC again, if a lesbian couple has a child and there's a birth mother and a non-birth mother, all that the non-birth mother has to do to establish their legal parentage is essentially send in a form that takes very little time to fill out. And the government basically just automatically recognizes and grants them legal parentage.
Is that only if they're married?
Yes, that's as a general rule if they are married. I don't want to force radical people who oppose the institution of marriage to get married. But if you are a gay person having kids, you should strongly consider getting married.
That's
because
fair.
These protections do tend to flow from marriage. Because that's just the way that the sort of legal structure of parentage is set up, for better or worse. But there are also other states where if you are the non-birth parent, you have to go through an entire process of second parent adoption that can cost thousands of dollars and take months, if not years. And the state will treat you like a stranger to your own child and require like home visits. You might have to write an essay about why you deserve to adopt the child. It's really, really horrible. And so this is another area where, again, it is very much worth moving with your feet if you have the means, if you're able to do so, because having a child in a red state, if you are gay, can expose you to a lot of legal danger if anyone ever tries to contest your parentage, or if the state ever refuses to acknowledge you as the legal parent.
Is there anything that people can do to prepare beyond, moving to a friendlier state?
Well, let me just add one thing. I mentioned this federal law that requires the federal government to recognize same-sex marriages, requires states to recognize same-sex marriages if they were entered into legally elsewhere. There is language in that law that may well apply to parentage. This is totally untested, but the law suggests that states have to honor the rights that flow from marriage. And as I said, parentage is generally one of those rights, one of the core rights that when a married couple has a child, that child is legally theirs. And by the way, that principle goes back to way before any gay people were getting married. That goes back to adoption, to straight women using sperm donors. Like, it has long been the baseline rule that when a married couple has a child, that child is legally theirs. And so I do think that there will be a test case, maybe sooner rather than later, if someone moves from a blue state to a red state and the red state doesn't want to acknowledge their parentage over their own child because they're gay and they aren't the birth parent. What will happen? I don't know, but that is a very real possibility.
Well, Mark, are there any terrible things I haven't even been able to imagine that I haven't mentioned?
Well, you just asked sort of like, what can people do about it? You know, I think this is an area where local action matters so very much. Getting your state legislature to change the laws is so very important. And in some instances, you might have to do it by ballot initiative, like California overturning its own ban. Getting that off the ground is one of the best things that you can do for LGBTQ people and their families under a Trump administration. Yes, there are horrible things that the Trump administration can do to try to roll back rights federally, but a lot of these rights, especially when you're talking about parentage, they are just rooted deeply in state law. And so if you live in a swing state, if you live in a purple state, one of the top priorities should be getting a law through the legislature that can protect LGBTQ families. And, you know, this does not always divide perfectly along red and blue lines. So, for instance, South Dakota, which is now like a ruby red state, the South Dakota courts have created a very liberal regime for surrogacy, including, of course, for same-sex couples. And the legislature considered overturning it and banning surrogacy or imposing really draconian regulations. And the legislature is controlled by Republicans, but they decided not to. The bill ended up dying and has not been revived for several years now, because advocates flooded the state and told their stories and said, please do not take away this gift from us and from other families like us. So Republicans can be movable on this issue. We saw it in Michigan, too, when Democrats gained a trifecta. They passed a great bill for same-sex parents, and some Republicans ended up joining in support of it. This is an area where you got to tug on legislators' heartstrings. You got to tell personal stories. You have to appeal to these sort of broad American values. And can I just say something that might be a little bit provocative on the show, Christina?
Please.
I guess I sort of hinted at this earlier when I said I don't want to offend people who oppose the institution of marriage.
Uh-oh, here we go.
We're moving into a somewhat more conservative period of American history and American life. I mean, whether we like it or not, like, this is happening. And this is going to be dark for a lot of people. And the question maybe should not be, what is the most logical and equitable way to envision and structure queer life in the abstract? I think the question should be, how do we maximize protections for queer people given the circumstances that we face today?
Yeah.
And I think that taking overtly radical stances is probably really unwise right now. Attacking the institution of marriage, condemning, having children, raising a family as some kind of bourgeois excess or luxury or extravagance, I think it's really unwise. I think we have to look back to what playbooks have succeeded in the past, and what worked with marriage equality itself was really playing up traditional values and saying to judges and legislators and the public, these couples want to be like everybody else. They want to have the same rights as everybody else. And I totally get why people bristled at that and still bristle at that. Like, that is not necessarily the argument that in a perfect world advocates should have had to make. But it was the one that resonated the most and gained the most traction with the people in charge and the people who were making these decisions. And so today, once again, I think that question should be top of mind. Like, not what is right in a highly abstracted, way of looking at it, but what works, what gets laws passed, what convinces judges and policymakers. And critical theory isn't going to cut it. Radical queer liberation, as much as we might support it, is not going to get the South Dakota legislature to protect same-sex parents. What's going to get them to do that is appealing to traditional values and trying to carve out a space of inclusion for LGBTQ people in those values. And so I view that as one of the main struggles ahead. And I can't stress enough that I'm not saying that radical queer liberation is bad. Like, that is not what I am saying. What I'm saying is there needs to be a heavy dose of realism in these fights and struggles. And what works is not necessarily what all of the advocates think should work.
This is also interesting when I think about how this applies to the struggle for trans rights and, access to healthcare, where there's been a lot of talk recently, including on this podcast, about sort of the harms that visibility can bring. Whereas I think the stance in the past has often been like, visibility is why gay people gained their rights, which to a large extent is true. I just did a whole 7-episode podcast about Harvey Milk and this big coming out movement in the 1970s, which I do think was essential to gay people becoming accepted in their communities and gaining rights and protections. But we're not seeing the same thing when it comes to trans people. And increased visibility has brought increased attacks, and not just sort of a fleeting backlash, but which it seems to be sort of a concerted and building momentum toward depriving trans people of safety and rights. And so when you think about, appealing to people's traditional values, I think we've seen some of that in the efforts by parents of trans kids to come out and say, this is my nuclear family and we're just like you. And really all I want is for my kid to be happy and not hate themselves and be able to play a sport because that's a bright spot in their life. And there's something that not necessarily conservative about that, but feels like it's kind of taking the same tack that you're thinking about or that you're talking about. And I wonder what other sort of ways we can, be fighting for the things that we all want and need, but sort of modify the messaging in a way that gets the message across to a broader segment of America.
Yeah, totally. Your excellent podcast.
Thanks, Mark.
About this did get me thinking about the visibility trap and like this double-edged sword that we're seeing now where putting more transgender people in the public eye is not necessarily increasing support. I will just note, I think one issue here is that a lot of the litigants in these trans rights cases are minors who go by pseudonyms, who, for obvious reasons, don't want to have their identities in the public eye. And God, of course I understand that.
Yeah.
Think about just the bullying they would receive at school, let alone, nationwide from random strangers on the internet. There would probably be bomb threats to their school district. It would be horrible. I totally understand that. But I do think it deprives the public of a kind of education that impact litigation is supposed to serve. Like, impact litigation is supposed to tell a story and provide a narrative to the public that helps them understand why some of their biases might have been wrong and why they should change their minds. That was done so effectively with marriage equality. But for so many of these transgender cases, for safety reasons, for privacy reasons, the litigant has to be kept private and concealed from the public, for lack of a better word. And so the public doesn't see and fills in their head their worst image, I guess, of who this person could be. And of course, Republicans are all too happy to provide that in their disgusting propaganda against trans equality. And I don't know what the solution for that is. I've spoken with lawyers and advocates who work on these cases. I think they're flummoxed by this as well. Their obligation is to the client. So they're not going to say, hey, why don't you go on national news and show your face so that everyone can see that you're the transgender child who just wants to continue healthcare. But I do hope that in much of the country, being able to see who is being targeted, who is being affected would change, hearts and minds. I don't know what to do about it. I laud all of the brave transgender people who are willing to come forward and tell their stories. I'm hoping that they change more hearts for the better rather than activating some horrible bigotry. But it's definitely going to be a slog and a battle, and it's not going to be as clean a win in the sort of public story that marriage equality so obviously was for gay people.
Well, thank you again, Mark, for taking time out in this really hard week to chat about this. I, as always, appreciate your clarity and your insight on this. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
That's it for the main show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed, where this week, Mark will stick around to help us update the gay agenda. If you're not already a subscriber, remember, by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on all our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/outwardplus. You can also send us your feedback and topic ideas at outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review and rave about the show so other people can find it. Until next week, stay gay.